Focus will be into the history of Jeremiah the prophet. There are certain things that we have looked already yesterday. For example, what happened by this time? What happened to Assyria? Assyria was the greatest empire in those days, but then you have Assyrian, the king of Assyria, for example, after Ashurbanipal, Ashur-etil-ilani, and other sons started, their power has to erode, and they started to fail. And so we know what happened. The Assyrian Empire started to go down, and a new empire started to come up. That is Babylon. Babylonian Empire started to come up under Necho, and actually Babylon joined with Egypt, and they under Necho, and they started to fight. And we know that finally Babylonian defeated Assyrian army. We looked at that one, especially Nebuchadnezzar. By the time Nebuchadnezzar came into power, his father's name was Nabopolassar, and Assyrian army vanquished with Necho, that is Egypt, from Pharaoh Egypt, and his Egyptian army in full retreat. Babylon came into power. We looked at last class. We also looked at Josiah, right? He was the king in the southern kingdom, right? He brought some reformation, worship of Yahweh, right? And it was like he was the one who came to power at the age of 8. And we see at the age of 16, his heart was turned to the Lord. And then there are a lot of series of reformation in southern kingdom in Judah. And he reestablished the worship of Yahweh, right? So for him, there was the support of Hilkiah, the high priest. And so he did a lot of reformations in Judah. But it was short-lived, Josiah's reform. He served only to forestall the inevitable judgment that God has promised to bring against southern kingdoms. It brought a gap in the judgment against southern kingdom. And we know that Josiah died very early when he tried to prevent Necho from of Egypt and he attempted to prevent him from coming to the aid of the Assyrian forces. And what happened here is a war that takes place. He's dead in that war. So Josiah died, right? And this is what Josiah engaged Necho's forces at Megiddo, fatally wounded, died shortly. So what happens? The next person comes, Jehoahaz, right? With the death of Josiah at the hands of Necho II at Megiddo, Jehoahaz in 609 BC, that he is Josiah's second son, became his successor, right? So Jehoahaz, he's also known as Shalom, another name for Jehoahaz. He was an evil king, did not embrace the reforms of his father, but reverted to the abominable practices of his wicked predecessors, Manasseh and Ammon. So he brought back idol worship. His reign was cut short after only 3 months, when Necho, the Egyptian pharaoh, concerned that Jehoahaz might harbor the same pro-Babylonian sentiments as his father, and replaced him with his older brother, Jehoiakim, right? So what happened? Because Egypt was still in influence and power, he dethroned Jehoahaz, sent him to Egypt, and his older brother, he's also son of Josiah, Jehoiakim was appointed as the king of Judah, right? And now happens another story about Nebuchadnezzar. After crushing the coalition of Assyrian and Egyptian forces at Carchemish, crown prince, the son of Nabopolassar, that is Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylonian army pursued Egyptian army. Necho is the leader of Egypt. And so here Nebuchadnezzar attacks Egyptian army that was located in Palestine. And the retreating Egyptians offered little resistance. And as a consequence, Nebuchadnezzar was able to remove them from the region and quickly replace Egyptian hegemony with the Babylonian, right? So you have a brief window, Assyrian, then a brief window of Egyptian's power. Remember, Egypt was the first biggest power that is known to like it is the history explain. Egypt was a big power at that time. Then its power has gone down. Assyrian Empire was in its pinnacle of power. Now Assyria got a brief window. Egypt came back, but Babylonian destroyed Egyptian power. And finally, to ensure Judah's loyalty, he made Jehoiakim swear allegiance and sent a number of Jewish captives, including prophet Daniel, back to Babylon, right? So it is during the time of Jehoiakim that Daniel and others came to Babylon, all right? The death of Nebuchadnezzar's father. So Nebuchadnezzar was the crown prince. Nabopolassar was actually king, but main ruling happened under or by Nebuchadnezzar. So when his father died, in the same year, forced Nebuchadnezzar to cut out short further pursuit and return to Babylon in order to secure his own succession, because Nebuchadnezzar was the warrior who was fighting in the battle and even defeating Egyptian army. But now Nabopolassar, his father was ruling, he died, so he had to come back. Jehoiakim, also Jehoiakim, also known as Eliakim. So he has got two names. It is important to remember these names. Pursued the same rebellious course as his father. Together they succeeded in overturning the budding reform movement begun under the Josiah, their father, right? So two sons are following not their father, but other former leaders. Because of heavy tribute required by Egypt, Jehoiakim was only too glad to switch loyalties to Babylonians, right? When Nebuchadnezzar liberated Palestine from Egyptian control. So they were loyal to Babylonian. Jehoiakim remained loyal to Babylon until 602 BC, when, because of the burden of Babylonian sovereignty, he attempted to rebel. Jehoiakim. What is the result? Yes, Nebuchadnezzar sent troops from Babylon and from some of his western vassal states such as Aram, Moab, and Ammon. These captured Jerusalem, put Jehoiakim in shackles, threatened to deport him to Babylon. Actually, he was defeated and forced Jehoiakim to submit to Babylon again. As punishment, Nebuchadnezzar ordered his troops to strip the temple of much of its sacred articles, bring them to his own pagan temples in Babylon, which is very, very important part of the history. So this is the time he invaded the temple and brought all the vessels to Babylon. 601 BC, emboldened by stunning upset of the Babylonian forces on the Egyptian border by the determined Egyptian army, Jehoiakim once again rebelled against the Babylonians, right? In 599 BC, Nebuchadnezzar sent his forces into northern Syria. By the end of 598 BC, had Jerusalem under siege. So that means until this time, Jerusalem was not completely taken. Temple was invaded, but not the entire city. At some point, either just before or outside of the siege, Jehoiakim died. And remember his son Jehoiachin. Kim is given to his son Chin, the leadership, right? So you have another king, Jehoiachin, right? So that's a part of this. Now, Jehoiachin, in the spring of 597 BC, after being in power for only 3 months, he recognized the futility of further resistance and surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian forces that had besieged the city. Nebuchadnezzar summarily replaced Jehoiachin with his uncle Zedekiah. So what happened? Not for a long time, for a short period, after his rule of Jehoiachin, another person, Nebuchadnezzar, came and replaced Jehoiachin with his uncle. So here you have one more person, Zedekiah. It is another person. He's Josiah's third son, also known as Mattaniah, and deported Jehoiachin to Babylon with the royal family. So here is the king of Judah coming to Babylon captivity. Of all the leading citizenry, including the prophet Ezekiel and all the skilled craftsmen. So you have a big group coming from Israel to Babylon. And that includes Ezekiel. To symbolize his success, Nebuchadnezzar again raided temple treasures, carried much of the valued items. Now you have a story of Jehoiachin. He is also known as Jeconiah or Coniah. So please understand there are various names used for Jehoiachin. And it is very important, Jeconiah or Coniah, because in Ezekiel, and if you read Jeremiah, you will see a curse for Jeconiah, that God curses him. So while Jehoiachin endured many years of political prisoner, he was a prisoner until 562 BC. And then he was elevated in a status by Babylonian king, not Nebuchadnezzar, but next king, evil Merodach. Evil Merodach. He was, so Jehoiachin is elevated into a status and given a position or a pension, not a position, pension and a position in a royal court until his death. Although Jehoiachin ruled in Jerusalem only for a short time, he is described as having followed evil practices of his predecessors, brothers, and fathers' practices, right? So that's what happens. Then you have one more person here. His name is Zedekiah, another king, right? He's another weak ruler like his predecessors. Again, same idolatry. Even after exile, Babylonian inversion, king of Judah followed idol worship, right? And then at one time he was enticed by the prospects of an ally in new Egyptian Pharaoh, not Necho, a new one came, Hophra. And in spite of numerous warnings from God, Zedekiah rejected Babylonian suzerainty and declared independence, right? So again, what happens? You have Nebuchadnezzar attacking again Judah. Now Zedekiah and the inhabitants were able to withstand the siege for a period of 2 years with a lot of sufferings and privation. They just encamped in the city, and they stayed there. Zedekiah stayed there for 2 years, broken only by a brief respite when the Babylonian forces were forced to withdraw in order to respond to an Egyptian threat to the south. Finally, 586 BC, the walls of Jerusalem were breached and city fell. Zedekiah and his army attempted to escape, but were caught by Babylonians, and Zedekiah was forced to watch slaying or a slaughter of his sons before himself, and he himself was blinded, taken to exile. So you have Zedekiah taken to exile, blinded. They blinded him. Nebuchadnezzar summarily executed a number of the priests, army officials, and citizens, and he then exiled the remaining population, except for the poorest and those who were as allies. The rest of them were taken as captive. City walls were torn down. It was burned. And quite interesting, if you visit Jerusalem, and you will see the elements of burned city that happened hundreds of years ago. And remaining temple treasures were taken back to Babylonian as trophies of war. All right, so that is what is Zedekiah. Finally, as we study Jeremiah, we need to look at one more person. All right, that is Gedaliah. Following the destruction of Jerusalem and the deportation of population, Nebuchadnezzar appointed a pro-Babylonian leader, Jewish leader Gedaliah, as a governor of remaining Judeans. So there were still some people who were living in Judea. So he was a governor, not a king. Gedaliah's tenure was short-lived, however, and spurred on by the recently defeated Ammonite king, that is Baalish, and smarting over Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. Several Judeans, led by Ishmael, a member of the royal family, conspired to slay Gedaliah along with the Babylonian officials, and left behind and were successful. So when the forces loyal to the slain governor found out, they sought to take revenge, but the conspirators escaped and fled into Ammon. So the loyalists, fearful of Babylonians' reprisals, took the remaining Judean officials, including Jeremiah and Baruch, and they fled to Egypt, not Babylon, Egypt. So that is the story. This is the end of Israel as a nation, if you say. If you look at something that began by Moses, and they entered the land of Canaan, you have the first king, Saul. Then here is, I don't think Gedaliah was not a king, but at least Jehoiachin, right, is considered to be last rightful king, and God cursed him and said, Jehoiachin, none of your descendants will rule again, sitting on the throne of David. And so Israel as a nation is over by this time period, by Babylonian captivity, right? Is over. So that is about the history, friends. Now we need to look at some of the issues in Jeremiah. We will look at that in the next class.